Yeah, I think we are about ready to begin. So, Carmen, welcome to PIDE. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics together with the World Bank. World Bank is our partner. We do a lot of things together. So together with the World Bank today, we offer you Carmen Reinhart. I think everybody knows Carmen Reinhart. Carmen, your book in Pakistan, this time is different, it's a big hit. So I don't need to introduce you, everybody knows you. But Carmen is now also the Senior Vice President and the Chief Economist of the World Bank. So I hope to see you in Pakistan someday, Carmen, when COVID is over. We must get you to come to Pakistan. You must come and see us. You know, I'm sure you'll enjoy Pakistan. It's not a bad place, despite the bad press we get. We can still give you a 5-star tour. But I'm especially glad that you're with us. And I'm especially glad that you're going to talk about macroeconomic challenges post-COVID. This is a real treat. You'll learn a lot from Carmen. She truly knows this area very well and has done a lot to help the world. And I'm sure that Carmen will delight us today, not only with her knowledge about the world, but also about Pakistan. So I won't stand between you and Carmen. I will give the floor right away to Carmen. But before I do that, I have to thank Gonzalo Varela, a colleague from the World Bank who makes such things happen. Gonzalo, we really thank you for making these things happen. Carmen, over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Nadeem. You didn't mention that we've known each other for decades and decades.
Exactly. Proud to call Carmen a friend from many decades ago.
Indeed. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Thank you for hosting me. And I am going to try to share the screen. I think I have a few core slides. And what I'm going to talk about today is what I've been calling the reversal problem, which is a major setbacks in various types of development fronts. I'm going to focus naturally on the macro side and how I see the reversal problem, which I will define, playing out, and all the kinds of policy dilemmas that brings about. So let me try to get my slides up. Bear with me, please. Can you see this?
Yet, no.
No?
Not yet, no.
Let me see. Okay. My apologies. Let me give it one more try.
Take your time.
Yeah.
Or you can email me the slides. I can.
Yeah, let me email you the slides.
Great.
I'm having, for some reason, I'm having tough time.
Don't worry, we'll handle it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Nadeem, can you email me so I can just attach it?
Okay. I'm emailing it to your World Bank address. I
Yeah,
couldn't get it.
yeah, the World Bank one, please.
Yeah. Done.
Uh, yeah, basically, let me define the reversal problem, and take it from there. This is an issue that I've been talking about recently in the context of really the collected post-COVID recovery, if one can call it recovery. And the reversal problem is coming after what one would call, many years after the wave of financial crises and debt crises in the 1990s, which hit Pakistan and had a crisis in 99. After that wave, there was a period in the 2000s and into even the global financial crisis. The global financial crisis, as we know, was called global, but it was mostly a crisis about advanced economies. And in that period through around 2014, 2015, emerging markets and developing countries did relatively well. It ups and downs and so on, but on the whole, it was a more favorable environment. In macro, better growth, inflation came down for the most part, and financing, importantly from China, was growing rapidly. And all of this began to reverse even before COVID, around 2014, 2015, and then entered COVID. And the crisis is now lingering into its second year. And if you were to look at some of the salient features of the post-COVID crisis, one of the most sharper features is how it's hit emerging markets and developing countries vis-a-vis the advanced economies. If you look at the share of countries that had declines in per capita GDP in 2020, it was about 90% of the 194 countries that the IMF and World Bank track. And if you push back the series on per capita GDP historically, 90% is higher than the World War I, than the Great Depression, than World War II, and that the debt crisis of developing countries in the 1980s. So this is really a synchronized shock, and to a degree that we had not really seen it in any of the data, at least since 1900. And in the aftermath of 2020, the recovery process that has materialized is very, very regressive, very polarized. So if you take those same 196 countries and you look at the share of countries that by the way, I sent it to my assistant and I thought that was the quickest, but we'll see.
Carmen, I got it. Don't worry.
Okay. If we look at the share of countries that, why don't we go to the, okay, that's where we are. If we look at the share of countries having an output collapse in 2020, as I said, it was 90%, and this is a historic high. But if you look at how they've recovered, the differences between advanced economies and emerging markets and developing countries is very, very striking. Why don't we go to the next page? And this is where the reversal problem comes in. If you look at indicators from credit rating agencies, per capita GDP, and a variety of other metrics, the convergence that we had seen in the run-up to the COVID crisis has not only not continued, it has backpedaled, it has backtracked, it has reversed. And let's move on to the next page, please. And if you look at the share of countries by income group, about 41% of the advanced economies have the per capita GDP that they had in, or higher, at least as high as what they had in 2019. If you look at middle income countries, only 27.5% have recuperated, have recovered the per capita GDP level they had in 2019. And in low income countries, the share is even lower. If you look at the bottom panel of this table, what you see is something even more striking, because for many emerging markets, the growth slowed down. The decline in per capita GDP had begun pre-COVID. And so actually, if you compare 2021 to the previous peak, when the peak was not 2019, what you see is that for low-income countries, almost 88%, or about 88% of countries are below per capita GDP, while for advanced economies, that share is 35. So next slide, please. The unevenness of the unevenness of the COVID recovery can be traced to a variety of things, whether it is the firepower that advanced economies had in being able to provide much greater fiscal policy stimulus, monetary policy stimulus, or financial sector support than EMs, whether that was entirely the big story, or whether the story is also very differential vaccination rates, a combination of these things, greater, just general greater access to international capital markets, whatever the reason behind it was, the legacy in 2021 and into 2022 is one of an extremely uneven recovery and the reversal of years, if not decades, of progress towards convergence. Next slide, please. During the pandemic and into the present, that decline, that contraction in per capita GDP has been accompanied by very large, unusually large and persistent fiscal deficits, which continue as the lack of recovery. And I know, just to be clear on how I use the word recovery, I know from talking to my colleagues that in Pakistan, the rebound that we have seen in GDP and the issue of overheating and so on, it sounds like a recovery, it looks like a recovery, but if you look at per capita income, it is still below what it was. It's still below peak. And importantly, I think the reason that the current environment is characterized as one of overheating is because potential output, estimates of potential outputs have been lowered, not because this has been a full recovery as defined by being at least as well off as you were before the crisis. And so the large financing needs, which are in the case of Pakistan, accompanied by what one would call, what one would classify as the twin deficit, not just fiscal, but also external, are a big feature adding to the vulnerability of the current environment. So less than full recovery, large financing gaps, and next slide, please. And rising levels of debt are sort of the core or some of the core issues on the risk side and the macro challenges at the moment. If you look at public sector debt, both domestic and external, over the long time frame again, one looks at emerging markets as a whole, and emerging markets and developing countries as a whole, and relative to the advanced economies, the levels of indebtedness appear moderate, if not modest. However, as I argued more than 20 years, or about 20 years ago in a paper with Ken Rogoff and Miguel Sevastano, developing countries are debt intolerant. So even lower levels of debt have been associated in the past with debt crises and debt restructuring. In effect, if you look at the major debt buildups that, and if you look at debt restructurings, external debt restructuring in emerging markets since World War II, more than half of those debt restructurings occurred at debt levels that would have met the Maastricht criteria. So you don't need the very high levels of indebtedness that we see in many of the advanced economies to brew a debt crisis. And as I noted, many countries already entered the COVID pandemic with more elevated levels of debt, and the last 2 years have accelerated that debt buildup. A relatively newer feature of the COVID debt buildup is that the debt buildup has been particularly pronounced in domestic debt. So the level and the share of domestic financing has increased notably for this group as a whole. Next slide, please. This chart also helps understand a big difference between the dilemma of the emerging markets and the dilemma of the advanced economies. The advanced economies, for example, if you very often in discussions of debt and fiscal trajectory, one of the things that's recurrently highlighted by people like Olivier Blanchard is, well, yes, debt levels are high, but the tolerance to debt, the ability to sustain debt is much higher because rates are low for long, rates are low forever. And in effect, if we were to do this picture for advanced economies, what you would see is that debt servicing, even especially interest payments, but debt servicing and interest payments have been on a secular downtrend. And lo and behold, there's much less reason to worry about debt. That has not been the case for emerging markets. Emerging market debt servicing has been on the rise. This highlights one dimension of it. This is only external debt service, so it doesn't include the increase that we've seen in recent work with Ken Rogoff, Ayhan Kos, and Francisca Orsón from the bank. We've made this point fairly emphatically that, if you look at advanced economies, the trend is this. If you look at emerging markets, the trend is this on debt servicing. And what this highlights for external debt is that since about 2010, debt servicing as a share of exports has doubled. And this is only through 2020, which is the latest figures available through the international debt statistics of the bank. But our early estimates for 2021 show an even sharper increase. Next slide, please. Complicating all of this. So, I've talked about twin deficits. I've talked about rising debt. I've talked about per capita incomes that haven't gone back to pre-crisis levels, and the accompanying debt having soaking in a larger share of revenues as debt servicing costs increase. Complicating this has been a more recent vintage, but nonetheless very sharp pickup in inflation rates. And the phenomenon of higher inflation in the last 2 years is fairly broad and not region specific. It certainly has hit Pakistan with inflation, oscillating between 11 and 12% at the moment. But it's hit advanced economies, it's hit middle income, it's hit low income. And the share of countries with inflation rates greater than 5%, and I use 5% simply to make the point that, this is more than twice the inflation targets in most of the major advanced economies. But if you were to do also the same exercise for share of countries above 10%, you would still get this very marked increase, although you would lose the advanced economies. And if you go even more extreme, that's the bottom panel, and look at cases where annual inflation rates are above 40%, that share has also, as more countries have had very serious difficulties, including some classic chronic inflation countries like Argentina, but also the more recent extreme cases in Lebanon, the big surge in inflation in Sudan, and these are the more extreme cases. But the point that I'm making here is that in addition to all the other macro challenges, now there is an added challenge in which inflation is creeping higher. The big debate is whether this is a transitory feature associated with post-COVID and bottlenecks associated with COVID, or if it's something of a more lasting nature. My own view, and this has been, you can trace this for months and months now, making the point that central banks have been too upbeat and complacent about about viewing the pickup in inflation as predominantly and dominated by temporary phenomenon. I think that, and we can discuss this in greater depth, but I think that while certainly some of the supply-driven bottlenecks associated with COVID are more likely to be temporary in nature, I would remind everyone of two things. One is the monetary stimulus in the advanced economies during COVID is on an unprecedented scale in peacetime, period, unprecedented. The comeback I get, that's number one. The comeback I get on that score is that, well, look, during 2008, 2009 global financial crisis, central banks in the US, in Europe, Japan, all responded also very aggressively with quantitative easing, with sharp reductions in interest rates. And indeed, that certainly did not have any lingering consequences on inflation. So it's okay that during COVID, we had an even bigger policy response, both on the QE front, on the interest rate front, and taking it a step much further on the creation of number of facilities to provide liquidity to various sectors of the economy. So why might this be inflationary in the COVID round when it wasn't during the global financial crisis? Well, again, this is an abbreviated version, but the general point being the supply shocks that we are seeing unfolding here were certainly not present at the time of the global financial crisis and its aftermath. That was a major aggregate demand shock, and it stayed largely within the context of aggregate demand. The supply shocks we're seeing are more akin to what we saw in the 1970s. And those supply shocks of the 70s were much easier to pinpoint because you could say, aha, it's OPEC, it's oil. Now we still have energy prices. We also have food prices, and we have a whole host of supply disruption, including transport costs, all kinds of mismatch in labor shortages, and all kinds of impacts across sectors. So it's a much more diverse and complicated supply shocks that we're contending with. And that is one dimension why I think the inflation issue is, if not permanent, few things in life are permanent, but more persistent. The second is the policy response of the central banks, which the big lesson from the 1970s was that central banks were not really able to cope with supply shocks. And a takeaway was that the recurring efforts of the Federal Reserve and other central banks to stimulate the economy in the face of adverse supply shocks led to a cumulative increase in inflation. First, it was more gradual and then more drastic. So central bank policy was one of doing too little and too late, of following markets rather than being proactive. And I think there's a real danger that, notwithstanding whatever tightening we may get in 2022, that the tendency for major central banks will be to be very cautious about the magnitude and the timing of their withdrawal of liquidity conditions and normalization. So for these reasons, for the policy response, for the complicated supply structure, I think higher inflation is going to be also a post-COVID challenge. Let me turn to the next slide. Again, if you think I picked a slide deck to depress everyone, well, you would be partially correct. But what I am highlighting is that the current conjuncture is very complicated because the problems are multifaceted, and not surprising if I'm also saying, well, look, for most countries, per capita GDP hasn't really recovered. And there's been this uneven recovery between advanced and emerging markets and developing countries. Well, the same story of unevenness of recovery holds within country. Poverty rates have increased in the work that we do on poverty and shared prosperity. On that flagship report, we documented late last year that poverty rates increased, global poverty rates increased for the first time since 1998. This is part of, again, going back to the issue of the more alarming reversal of some of the benign trends. If it's too soon to have conclusive evidence at the at a large cross-country level, but what evidence we do have for individual case study, all the evidence also points to not only has the pie become smaller, but the distribution also has become more uneven. So not surprisingly, poverty is also associated with a worsening in income inequality within country. And this also, by the way, correlates or is exacerbated by the inflation developments that I previously discussed. A big feature of inflation is, first and foremost, inflation is a tax, and it is a regressive tax. If you look at what is also adding to that regressive edge, the recent rise in inflation, like the rise in inflation in the 1970s, has been accompanied by relative significant increases in food prices and energy. And food and energy, of course, play a very major role. If you compare the structure of consumer price indices across across countries, of course, you see that food and energy loom larger as per capita incomes go down. Advanced economies have a smaller share of food and energy in the consumer basket. Same is true for households. So the households with the highest exposure in their consumption basket to food and energy are the lower income households. Hence, the nexus between poverty rates, further contractions to discretionary income, and the inflation picture that I put on earlier. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide because I want to turn to policy questions before opening the floor for discussion. The setback, the so-called scarring effect, is particularly, but not exclusively, if one looks at the drivers of long-term growth. Okay. Drivers of long-term growth, a big recurring element in most of the cross-sectional studies is human capital. And the work being done on the human capital index and all the evidence, however imperfect, that we have to date, is that the COVID crisis is having a significant impact on human capital, and it's likely to be a lasting effect. Schooling has progressed very unevenly. The return to normal schooling is been also very uneven, impacting those countries that were already doing worse in terms of human capital accumulation. In relation to human capital, the issues relating to the big increases in food price inflation has also meant that nutrition and our measurement of nutritional intakes has also posted significant markers of deterioration. And so the human capital picture is also suggesting that the effects on productivity, the effects on output may have lasting consequences. And so all these things that I've discussed pointed to very significant policy challenges. And, you know, on top of all of this, there is also at the moment a great deal of emphasis on countries becoming or adapting green technology. And so financing needs, as I noted in one of my earlier slides, both at the fiscal level and at the country level, are large. And financing needs, when one layers on top of that the need for transitioning to a greener economy, are even larger. So this really does pose very difficult policy dilemmas, which we can discuss, and I hope we do on the Q&A, both in terms of monetary policy and fiscal policy. If some of these issues relating to poverty, inequality, education, health, all the metrics of human capital point to the need for the government to have more rather than less expenditure to cope with those problems. At the same time, the high levels of indebtedness and higher debt servicing costs suggest that fiscal expansion and continuing buildup of debts have pose additional risks. So there's a tug of war between what is needed and what impacts that response would have. Similarly, on the monetary policy front, ensuring that the recovery is not derailed would, other things equal, benefit from not necessarily the kind of very aggressive expansion that we saw, an exceptional expansion that we saw in 2020. This was the first time that emerging markets as a group were able to do counter-cyclical monetary policy. But at the same time, the inflation phenomenon complicates the ability of central banks to maintain, even though as they normalize, it may swing the pendulum for central banks to have to tighten considerably to keep inflation at bay. So what I'd like to do is, hopefully, let me say, I do not believe in silver bullets. I think, caution in both the fiscal front and caution on certainly on the inflation front are extremely warranted. But I do not, at the same time, one has to recognize that whatever policy path is chosen, there are a series of risks associated. So silver bullets are not in the menu of options. So what I hope to do is maybe in the Q&A, we can flesh out and discuss more some of the policy issues, as well as any other issues that perhaps one of the things that I didn't do was provide more of a global context and what is happening with the US and with China and the global economy as a whole, and how might that impact EM. So I'm just suggesting that we can take the discussion whichever way you want to follow up on.
Much. This is a masterful and, as I said, a great overview of the world economy and with the way things are happening and the differential impacts everywhere and the great reversal that you talked about. Now, in a sense, you've come, Carmen, to a full kind of a heterodox impact of the COVID crisis, or whatever you might call it. I'm trying to think, because there's so many things that are happening that are on the negative side, as far as we are concerned, where I sit in Pakistan. But now with inflation, the way it's going, and the differential recovery, with the fact that the developing countries are doing better than us, and that we are facing increased poverty, as well as we have the twin deficit problem. And in Pakistan especially, we have a very large twin deficit problem without adequate reserves. So as you know, our common friend Raza Bakir is the governor of the central bank. I was just thinking about it from his point of view. You said that inflation might persist. Two questions that I would like to ask you. Why would you think that the supply problem would persist? Would the supply problems not ease themselves out very quickly, and therefore inflation, the inflationary impact die? Because you remember in the great so-called, in the post sort of 2008 recovery period, we thought inflation was kind of on the back burner. Okay, so now inflation is coming back. Would the supply problems cause a persistence of inflation? One. Two, you stress that central banks will have to be careful, but if I'm right, there will be a differential impact in the US and other countries. Quantitative easing will be pulled back, and if that is pulled back, then what should our response be? But because, as you know from your earlier work, as they pull things back out there, we suffer more because we do have capital inflow or outflow problems. If I remember right, every percentage increase in US interest rates will hurt us. Now, if Raza Wakir or the governor of central bank, I hate to bring him in personally, but just because you know him, if our central bank, for example, decides to pull back sharply, does that mean we'll have to go through a much more loss of output, more potential income loss, more poverty? So our policy choices kind of seem to be very difficult, if I might say so. So I'd like you to comment on that a little bit, if you can.
So, Nadeem, this is, you've hit on a variety of points that are, I think, it's a question of degree, okay? Some of the issues are also faced, some of the stark choices are also faced in the advanced economies, but on a different scale. The idea that emerging markets will have to do much more tightening than what we will see in the advanced. First, you asked a lot of questions, but I'm going to elaborate more on the persistent story, but also on the policy response, importantly. The idea that emerging markets have to do a lot more and a lot sooner than the advanced economies is precisely because of the capital inflow problem, the capital flow problem that you alluded to. That and then we can talk about how they do it, versus rates versus foreign exchange intervention. But the tightening of even modest, even a too little, too late kind of tightening in advanced economies has multiplier effects on emerging markets because you go from risk on to risk off. And so what you typically see is capital flows to developing countries and emerging markets start to decline. In the most extreme cases, you can have sudden stops, abrupt reversals. But even forgetting about the extreme cases, there are multiplier effects also because risk premium, sovereign risk premium tends to rise with international interest rates. So you have, as rates go higher, you saw the chart also I had on debt servicing. As rates go higher, it has outsized effects on interest rates on emerging markets, simply because not only have international interest rates gone up, but also the risk premium has gone up, usually accompanied by greater vulnerability and to downgrades in sovereign credit ratings. And at the end of the day, the higher perception of risk will come with currency depreciation. And then the typical central bank response to higher perceived risk, capital flight, capital flow reversal, currency depreciation is to tighten policy. I think one thing that we can say fairly conclusively, Nadeem, on the response to that is that even if you did have a lot of reserves, there are better uses of reserves than financing capital flight. Sure, you can, in the very short run, try to have the best of two worlds, so to speak, to stabilize the exchange rate without big hikes in interest rates. But that the overwhelming experience has been that you only have a relatively small window in which to do that, and often, in the most extreme cases, under the extreme duress, you may only have a few hours. I mean, the UK did lose 50% of its reserves during the exchange rate mechanism crisis in the early 1990s, and so considering that most of the countries, Pakistan included, external debt servicing is one of the many worries. Foreign currency reserves are better used to import goods and services that are, imports debt servicing rather than betting against the market. And so what I am getting at is that it's a very unpleasant arithmetic, that if you do not raise interest rates, the idea that, oh, well, this is going to keep, so you don't raise interest rates, so domestic debt servicing doesn't move higher. However, countries that have, like Pakistan, that have foreign currency debt, if you don't raise interest rates, the currency is going to crash. Witness the leading example of Turkey as it unfolds. And so there's no panacea, because your domestic debt servicing costs may be kept at bay for a limited period, assuming that, and that even assumes that the maturity structure of the domestic debt is not so short that, even without rate hikes, inflation expectations would drive debt servicing higher. So I think the reality is one that for the emerging markets, the trend is going to be fairly pronounced tightening in monetary policy. It's coming out of an exceptionally low, exceptionally stimulative environment with very negative ex post real interest rates. And you can't keep significant negative ex post real interest rates and deal with inflation at the same time. So, concretely, the shift towards tighter policies and some of the fears that it might derail, the recovery are not unique to EMs. It's a big debate in the US also on that score. It's a big debate in Europe. And in Eurozone, that debate is aggravated by the fact that you have a country like Italy, where their peak per capita income was in 2007. Okay, they're about 6% below what their per capita income in 2007 was. So, you have very diverse countries. So what I'm getting at is that the dilemma of how much to raise, how quickly, it's much more acute for emerging markets because of these multiplier effects, but it's also there for the advanced economies. So, you know, I think, however, the one dimension one can say is trying to fix this, trying to deal with the inflation issue, trying to deal with the currency depreciation via alternatives, i.e. reserve losses, tighter capital controls. Tighter capital controls mean parallel markets start to flourish. We've seen that movie before. It typically is not one that does anything beyond high time. But in the end, it is a starker choice.
Carmen, in Pakistan, we are heading towards greater, sort of more closing of the economy. We've started talking about, the debate has started on actually banning imports in certain categories. Capital controls are severely being tightened. Meanwhile, we're also talking to the fund, in fact, on the brink of renewing our fund program, which is fairly traditional. So the question that I'd like to ask you is, how would you see the traditional fund program revised or reviewed? You've done enough fund programs, you know about it. Think about it, for example, the scenario that you paint. It's a choice between very harsh adjustment, which we probably don't have the room to make, neither the political nor the sort of economic room, because quite frankly, we are a difficult economy to deal with. We haven't been able to make adjustment on the fiscal side. Should we learn to live with a higher rate of inflation? Is that a choice, for example? Should the fund relax its target on inflation, for example? That guys, okay, maybe we should have a higher rate of inflation to allow the domestic economy to grow. Or should we focus on inflation? I mean, it's basically placing ourselves in the Phillips curve. Where would you place ourselves in the Phillips curve going forward? Especially, as you know, when the Western countries tighten, as you point out, we'll need a differential speed of tightening. Maybe we'll have to tighten more than the Western countries. But that'll place a hardship on our young economy, where unemployment rates are already high, poverty rates are high. I mean, I'm trying to explore this dilemma. How would you play this dilemma? Where would you locate yourself on the Phillips curve?
Nadeem, you know, I think to some degree,
from what I hear from you, the Phillips curve will probably come inwards, right?
Yeah, but yes, but I do want to go back to the question you posed on fund, is the, you know, more relaxed attitude towards inflation. Look, I think both at the advanced level and at the EM level, there will be a tolerance for higher inflation rates. But I think there's a fallacy to think in terms, and this is going to sound quite cynical, but it is, between austerity and, you know, less austerity, inflation will bias some of that. Inflation is austerity. It's a tax. It's a tax that is not, people do not vote for that tax. It's levied by non-elected officials. That's why financial repression and inflation have been used throughout, because it is a tax nobody votes for, right? I mean, a few months back, you know, France tried to raise taxes, you know, for green purposes and so on. It led to riots. Colombia tried to raise taxes to prevent its, you know, not that it's unsustainable, but it's also, Colombia's been hacked very hard by the credit rating agencies with downgrades and so on, tried to raise revenues to correct fiscal imbalances, riots. So the reason it ends up being more inflation is not because inflation is not austerity. It is a very regressive tax, but it is a tax people don't vote for. It's done through more opaque mechanisms. So you asked multiple questions. So I do think that, yes, there's going to be a tolerance to somewhat higher inflation. I think in advanced economies, the way that discussion is shaping up is by saying, oh, look, we've undershot inflation by all these years. Therefore, the price level is not where it would have been had we met our goals, and we'll be able to look the other way for. That's not obviously how central banks word this, but watch what they do rather than necessarily what they say. Notwithstanding that higher tolerance, I think the austerity years are part of the problem, of the reversal problem that I talked about. But you also raised another very important issue, which I didn't quite mention, which is sort of round two of the reversal problem, which is, if you look historically, this is work that I did with Ken Rogoff on the modern history of exchange rate arrangements, when countries fragment when they introduce controls, when do parallel markets emerge, when do you start seeing current account restrictions reemerge? You see them in bad times. You typically get more liberalization. There's a chicken and egg problem there on causality, that in periods where there's greater foreign exchange shortages, the need to curb external deficits because of lack of inflows to fund these, you begin to rely more on more inward-looking policies, both on the capital account side and on the current account side. And that's what I called round two of the reversal problem, which is when the economic reversals turn into policy reversals. And, look, what controls do is typically buy you some time. But in terms of, if you look, and Pakistan had, since unification, we really haven't seen a return in the curb market, but you start tightening restrictions and parallel markets will emerge. As soon as rationing of foreign exchange. Now, look, I am not a big fan, and I've written about this extensively, of saying, oh, indiscriminate current account and capital account opening is the panacea. I'm very cautious about it because of the capital inflow problem that, liberalization sort of without any macroprudential is an invitation for a boom bust, okay? In the boom period, you do a lot of borrowing, you do a lot of bad borrowing in times of currency mismatch, maturity mismatches, you name it. So I'm not a big fan that open, but tightening restrictions in bad times, which is really what we're talking about here, seldom are associated with good outcomes. Now, I will caveat that by saying that there is a causality issue, that you introduced it because you were in bad shape, because you introduced it, it becomes worse. And so there's an element of self-feeding there. And part of that, Nadeem, is also through signaling. And my former colleague at University of Maryland, Alan Drayson and Leonardo Bartolini, did some very interesting work on asymmetric signaling. When you tighten controls on the capital account or current account during a boom phase, you're being prudential. So it doesn't have a negative connotation. When you tighten controls in bad times, in bad states of nature, the signaling effect is very different. It's more a signal of desperation rather than being prudential.
Mm-hmm. Carmen, one last question let me ask you. Where you sit now, you have a seat at the global sort of high table. If I look back, the debt crisis, the great divergence led to a kind of a consensus emerging over time, which was the Washington consensus. Now let's step back a little and think about the great reversal, the reversal that's happening. Do you see, or what are your thoughts, since you're going to be right there at the center of things? What are your thoughts on a consensus that needs to emerge to meet with this very difficult situation? The situation that you painted has really got me worried. A very difficult situation that's emerging around the world. And I don't think we've even begun to shape that consensus. So give us a glimpse of your thinking. How do you see yourself leading this emerging consensus, or what consensus should emerge, or how would you think about it?
Nadeem, I don't think I want to be clear. I think that the situation is an extremely difficult one and challenging along the many dimensions. I'm not suggesting the melodrama of the 1980s, okay? Because, not yet anyway, because part of that, so before I deal with is there a shift in consensus and what the international community, but before that, I just want to clarify, Paul Volcker in October 1979 put on his foot on the brake in the US when US inflation had hit 14%. So a more draconian measure was necessary to deal with years of buildup in inflation. I think I'm not looking at that. I'm looking at tightening, but as I mentioned, I think central banks will err on the side of doing too little and too late, because unlike 1979, corporates are highly leveraged in the US and in Europe and in Japan. Governments are highly leveraged, so there's a lot of political, their debt servicing costs are going up. That's a very political hot potato. And who wants to be the governor of the or chair of the central bank that burst an equity bubble? Okay, so just out of clarity, I'm not looking at a replica. But what were some of the policies of the 1980s in that Washington consensus? Well, that consensus, one of the salient takeaways for me has been how slowly it evolved. And, at the bank, I can honestly say that a big concern, David has voiced this in I don't know how many fora in the last couple of years, is that the debt problems aren't being recognized. And that if they're not recognized early on, you're going to go through this protracted process of waiting for resurrection, waiting for something, that will fix, and that creditors are not granting debt relief, that creditors, and this is a sobering statistic. As I've done a lot of work with Ken, with Christoph Trebisch, and with some researchers that I brought from Harvard to the bank on looking at debt servicing spells, that difficult debt crises, credit events, and so on. And a big takeaway, a big statistic is, on average, they lasted about 7 years, meaning it took creditors and debtors a very long time to work things out. And people will immediately say, no, but look, just last year, at the beginning of last year, Ecuador and Argentina had debt restructurings that were pretty quickly resolved. Again, one can confuse debt crisis resolution with putting a Band-Aid. And I think I think, Nadeem, the real risk is that the period ahead is one of more muddling through, that you do a little bit fund program is, okay, it is extended. You wrote about fund programs and the recurrent use of fund resources, and and on the debt front, those countries that do need serious debt restructuring, meaning face value reductions, that is going to be a long road to get there. And we already had an inkling of this with the DSSI. DSSI was introduced in spring of last year, and it ends now in December. And the fact is, during that period, there was no private sector participation. Creditors historically never rush in to embrace write-downs, debt write-downs. Chinese are not an exception, and China and Pakistan owes a lot of its debt to China. And the typical Chinese debt restructuring, is very much like the 1980s approach. The earlier 1980s, which is cash flow relief, in which you negotiate some grace period, perhaps some maturity extension, but mostly a grace period. But you don't change the underlying terms, and you don't write down face value, which means that on a net present value basis, some of these restructurings actually make you worse off. They certainly don't deal with the debt overhang problem. I'm not, bashing China on this. This was classic in the 1980s. Creditors don't want face value reductions. And we only got there with the Brady plan. And for the low-income countries, with the Haque plan, we only got there after more than a decade of trying almost everything else and it failing. So when you ask about the Washington consensus, now the Washington, we have the Paris Club has migrated to the G20, so as to include China, who hasn't shown an appetite for joining the Paris Club. So now the real Paris Club is in the G20. The common framework was introduced a year ago. And so far, we haven't even had a single restructuring under the common framework. I think, the IMF and the bank and the multilaterals during the pandemic, it tried to meet those needs of higher liquidity that were driven importantly by, an implosion in revenues, social spending needs, and so on. But in the case of the fund, in which its lending is of shorter maturities, that is going to come home to roost. Witness Argentina now. And that raises some of the very same issues as it has in the past. And the point that I'm adding to the long series of complications that I've talked about today is the complication that, notwithstanding the new names and common framework and the SSI and all of this, creditors are not going to be forthcoming in accepting significant debt write-offs. So debt overhangs are poised to persist. That's and the Washington consensus really hasn't. It'll have greater tolerance to inflation. It'll caution more about how. I think it'll caution more about how austerity is achieved. I think there will be more emphasis on revenue mobilization than on attacking the issue strictly on the expenditure side. How successful revenue mobilization is, of course, there will be a lot of variety across countries on their, capacity.
We are already revenue challenged, Carmen, as you know. We've talked about it many times. Pakistan is severely revenue challenged and fiscally challenged. We've not been able to solve our fiscal problem for the last 70 years. I don't hold out much hope there, but let me bring in Shahid from PIDE. Shahid, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Carmen. I'm research fellow at PIDE. I have a question. It's a two-part question, short one. First, this is not the first pandemic that has led to problems with the global economy. We had the Spanish influenza problem back in 1918, and at that time. So, do you see parallels over here? How that petered out, and how this one is going? And do you see any differences at what happened at that time to global economy and now? And the second part of my question is that one of the trends that has been going on since COVID-19 struck is work from home. So do you see it as persisting or not? Do you see it as a trend in the future?
Yeah,
trend in the future?
So these are two two recurring questions. They come up all the time. I did a short piece, Shahid, for Project Syndicate called This Time Truly Is Different, which starts out with a comparison to the 1918, 1919, 1920, because in India, which was the hardest hit during the Spanish influenza, it was well into 1920, which is indicative in that this was not a brief in and out. But what made it very difficult to compare the current situation with the previous global pandemic is also World War I. So, you had the major economic powers engaged in war. And if you look at 1918, which was a year in which deaths peaked in the United States, GDP growth was like 7%. Really, it was all about war production. Okay. And so in terms of the impacts on the global economy, one big difference, you had a wartime economy and then the resolution of the war. So it's very different. The idea that in the midst of a war, you would get lockdowns and shutdowns in economic activity, the way we have as a policy response, would not have been, a big part of the problem in the US was, you continue with wartime sell bonds, wartime bond rallies, the notorious one in Philadelphia, in 1918 that led to a resurgence of the influenza there. You try, in other words, you would try to go around business as usual, except, produce even more because you were at war. So that it's a very, I would note that there were scarring effects and that fertility rates, education, the human capital dimension in EMs suffered for long after the 1918. Okay, that's one, that the human capital impacts are there. I see, a much closer resemblance. So, but not on the policy response and not on the immediate economic consequences because of the context. On the working from home, look, I think there's a big buzz around anything that's also digitization. And, I think the pandemic has really given a big catalyst to working from home, to more emphasis of digital delivery methods, to more, it's too early to say, because here we are at the end of the second year, still with Omicron now, whether the change in work patterns will persist. But I think my bet, and there is an interesting NBR, if you send me an email, I can send you the references, a recent NBR paper on this issue, in which the baseline is that, yes, work patterns will change. We probably are overshooting on that side, but that the trend towards, more technology dependent and less locationally constrained work will that the pendulum is swinging there. I'm happy to send that reference along.
Great, please do, Carmen. Mohammed Khurram Shahzad.
Yes, sir. Yes, am I audible, sir?
Yes,
Yeah.
you
Okay.
are. Right.
Okay, first of all, I would like to thank Professor for giving us this wonderful session. So, before I ask a question, I want to tell that in Pakistan currently the biggest challenge is the inflation, and we are under the IMF bailout package. So, just I want to ask Professor that how can this, generally speaking, how can we how can Pakistan overcome this inflation? Because the governor, State Bank of Pakistan, he said that the inflation in Pakistan is because of the supply side issue, and we have seen that recently the State Bank has also increased the interest rates, the policy interest rates. So what's your take on that? I mean, how can the inflation be reduced in Pakistan? What's your take on that, Professor? Thank you.
Thank you. Carmen.
So, look, it's not really a pretty picture, meaning that, I alluded to a reference when I was talking about the United States and Paul Volcker in 1979, when he put his foot on the brake, inflation in the US was around 14%, while inflation's around 11, 12% in Pakistan now. More drastic measures are needed the longer, the bigger, the higher the inflation rate. So to really tighten, which is ultimately, look, the resumption of something closer to normality. So let's start at the beginning. Let's take the supply side and take the monetary policy side. On the supply side, I know this sounds cliche, but it happens to be factual that since we have such great uncertainty and a large dispersion on any point, point estimate of any forecast, in part because we don't know also what is happening with the longevity of this pandemic. One points to, as an insurance policy, vaccination as being critical. Okay, in terms of supply conditions, in terms of trying to get some sort of normality, vaccinations play a big role. I think, much of the inflation story is supply chain disruptions that, again, to the extent that they have a very big global component, there are certain things where you can't really tackle. I mean, transport costs are transport costs. So yes, I mean, and Nadeem was mentioning really, trying to close the current account deficit, the trade deficit, through more, close economy policies. But that won't really alleviate the supply chain issue. Okay, that may deal with the current account, but it won't deal with the supply chain issue. So what I'm saying is that on the normalizing, vaccinations play a role so that you can start from more. On the monetary policy side, no one said that tightening rates is something that any governor of any central bank wants to do. It's more what you need to do than what you, and it's an old debate, that in Pakistan, even with recent rate hikes, you still have negative interest rates because of the high inflation. And, inflation can be made persistent by doing too little and too late, because it becomes more ingrained in expectations, because the higher inflation produces lower ex post real interest rates, which is also, an inducement to borrow today. That's, it's a transfer from savers to borrowers. So the element that's, and that supply story has a lot of resonance all over, not just Pakistan. This is the issue that is more to Pakistan and EMs in general, is that exchange rate pass-through also plays a big role in inflation in a way that it doesn't do. That's not the case for the US. That's not the case for, and so how do you stem a slide in the exchange rate? Well, Turkey's trying it in a very different way by, making interest rates even more negative. So far, it hasn't really panned out. And I think we're headed for sharply higher interest rates in Pakistan and other EMs. Because again, the initial conditions are one in which these very negative interest rates, real interest rates, are, have to be addressed in order to have something meaningful on inflation. Now, I want to make the point that higher interest rates, it can stem the currency slide. Slowing the currency slide is an important factor to inflation stabilization. But it doesn't solve everything because it makes debt financing more costly for the government. Governments don't like that. So, one of the big recurring areas that I get asked about all the time from both advanced economies and EMs now is the whole issue of fiscal dominance. If external financing becomes tighter, more difficult to get, and countries can't really deliver smaller deficits or balanced budgets, then there's going to be a lot of continued pressure on the central banks to monetize. Monetization and inflation stabilization do not go hand in hand. And Argentina has brilliantly been showing that for a number of years now. So look, and apart from higher nominal and real interest rates raising debt servicing for the government, it does put more pressure on the domestic financial system. And I know that in Pakistan, borrowing is dominated by the government, but also, there's SOEs and all that. But their debt servicing also becomes more complicated. And so, it's not surprising that tightening of interest rates is also associated with a higher incidence of non-performing loans and banking problems.
Thank you. Okay, last question, Mohammed Ijaz.
Hello, thank you, Professor. So my question is from the perspective of a central bank policy. So you see, an economy like Pakistan, which is a small open economy, and through no fault of its own, it's facing multiple challenges. For example, international prices are hitting hard, and that's reflecting in our current account through higher oil prices and higher food prices. And if you look at the debt servicing, DSSI has said that the creditors are not willing to take a haircut. The best hope is that they would be delaying the payments, but actually there is no debt restructuring. So the inflation is already rising, and there is also pressure that a lot of debt, domestic debt, is on the Pakistan's government, and they wouldn't want the interest rate to raise. So in on top of that, the pandemic is, it's not over yet. So in such a case, what can a central bank do? On top of that, the historic high inflation number in the US has already sort of brought forward the normalization of monetary policy, which has, in relative terms, sort of put an extra pressure of tightening, because in terms of differentials, every emerging market would want to take care of that. Like they want to normalize earlier than the US does. So from all sorts, from all corners, central bank is sort of under pressure. So in such situation, what should a central bank governor do? And to deal with this situation, just your thoughts.
Look, I don't envy central bank governors or central bank at the moment. They're in a very difficult, unenviable position. You're absolutely right that, and I alluded to this on a number of occasions, that the inflation picture has a big global dimension, and including importing inflation from very expansive monetary policies in the advanced economies. But I think a really big challenge, and you brought this up, and I had brought it up earlier in responding to or in the previous question, a recurring area of debate and discussion when it comes to central banks is the issue of fiscal dominance, right? That if the government has having, to the extent that they can borrow abroad, they need to borrow abroad on more expensive terms because risk premium is higher, and liquidity conditions globally are moving to a tighter space. Then you shift your other things equal, unless you are successful in adjusting and reducing budget deficits. You shift your financing inward. And, in shallow markets, in thin markets, and Pakistan still has, a relatively thin internal debt market. That translates to higher debt servicing pretty quickly. And so this sets the stage. It really sets the stage. Less foreign financing, more reliance on domestic financing, the need to make that financing more expensive by the central bank providing less credit to the government. That's the recipe for fiscal dominance, because this, and so I think, central bank independence is, the question you're asking me is much easier to verbally give the response of what should be than to deliver it, because politically it is a very contentious, if those that are doing so the way that governments financing themselves is by borrowing from the central bank or placing their debt at domestic banks. That is, importantly, a setup for the tension on central bank independence. So what can a central bank do? It can try to the extent, again, this is a good bit of it, not necessarily in their hands, but is to safeguard that independence. That, central banks that play a significant and persistent role in debt financing. And I'm not just talking about the very exceptional years of the pandemic, but do so on a more chronic, sustained basis, have higher inflation rates. This is not a seat of the pants statement. I recently did, in the end of September, the Karl Brunner lecture for the Central Bank of Switzerland. And I focused a lot on central bank balance sheets and how these have shifted to much greater purchases of government bonds. The most extreme changes have been in the advanced economies rather than emerging markets. But if you break down emerging markets to those that have, on a persistent basis, higher shares of their portfolio. So a higher share of the existing government debt is held by the central bank, i.e. monetization. And those that don't, that have central bank holds very little of government debt. The average inflation rate in the previous group is significantly higher, is in effect on, double digit. And so the answer is, as I said, it's easier for me to say it than for central banks to be able to live through it and deliver it, which is, the critical role of independence, of limiting financing to the government. That will be what is needed to, stabilize. Higher interest rates are needed to stabilize currencies. Currency stabilization will help with inflation. Although again, I completely agree with what you said, that there is a big element on the inflation side that is global in nature, that has, global, and I think this is how I responded to Nadeem, that I do think that in IMF programs, for example, there is going to be somewhat more relaxed view as to what is acceptable inflation rates, but they're not in double digits.
Thank you, Carmen. This has been wonderful. I think, quite frankly, there are lots of things that we haven't put in there yet. It's a very risky world. If we throw in the US-China tension, if we throw in the rise of extremism everywhere in the world, we see in France rising extremism. The Trump phenomenon is not dead. Anti-vaxxers are alive. So it's a very, very interesting world that we are getting into. And then also, if you throw in technology, as you said, about working from home, but then there are other things emerging, for example, automation and autonomous vehicles, etc., which places extreme pressure on us. We just did a conference on opportunities in Pakistan and, took into account technology. And it's kind of worrisome. We send out labor and we get a lot of remittances from the world. Now, if technology catches on and our raw labor can't be exported, we will be in deeper trouble still. So the waters we are charting are very, very strange and very difficult. Thank you for giving us pause to think. Before I go, I'd like to ask Gonzalo to have a last word. Gonzalo.
Well, thank you so much, Nadeem, and thank you, Carmen. It has been a true pleasure to have you here virtually. For us, it's an honor, it's an opportunity to think about many of these issues. I want to reiterate the invitation that Nadeem made to you, extended to you to come. You're welcome here. You're going to be more than welcome, and we hope that you can put in your busy agenda a visit to Pakistan. We will really appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Absolutely, Carmen. You've owed me that for 30 years, so you have to come to.
I know, Nadeem. And at one point in time, this was going to happen. Then it kind of petered out and fell through. I was really hoping that in early spring to start traveling again.
Well, when you're traveling, Pakistan, put in your list, because now we have a race. I said, when you start traveling, you have to Pakistan on the list, because
yes,
this year,
indeed.
22, I'm going to go to Cuba. So let's see whether I go to Cuba first or you come to Pakistan first.
Well, and you may go to Cuba before I go to Cuba, because I've never actually gone back. I've actually never gone back. My mother went back, but so you'll probably get there before I will.
Before you. Well, we'll get you here next year, hopefully, as soon as we can deal with Omicron.
Look forward to that, Nadeem. This was very, very, great conversation.
Thank you very much. Carmen, I curse myself for not discovering Zoom earlier. One positive thing of COVID is our discovering Zoom. And now we can talk to people like you. Otherwise, we had to spend years trying to get people like you to come to Pakistan. This has been a great pleasure.
No, I have to say that the and it works both ways, because there are, you know, invitations that I get that in normal circumstances I would say no, because I can't travel. You know, it would blow an entire week, you know, which is a different, you know, so it certainly works both ways. I've enjoyed this enormously,
Great.
and it's
Thank you.
good to see
All
you,
the
and
best.
I will
Talk to-
tell Peter that
Yeah, I
I
just spoke to
was
him.
with
I
you.
just spoke to
Yeah.
him, so he's coming to Florida next week. So
Yeah.
talk to you soon, inshallah. All the best. Thanks a lot, Carmen. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye, Gonzalo.